It was the dead of winter in Montana, the kind of winter that tests a man's bones and makes even the strongest question whether spring will ever come. The wind screamed through the empty streets like a wounded beast, carrying with it sheets of snow that buried cars, fences, and even the old mailboxes that lined the lonely road. Martin Hayes, a 42-year-old single father and war veteran, stood at the window of his modest two-bedroom cabin with his arms crossed, staring at the storm with the heavy eyes of a man who had seen too much. Life had never been easy for Martin. He had served 2 tours overseas, returned home with scars both visible and invisible, and now was raising his 10-year-old son, Lucas, alone after his wife had left years ago. Money was tight, jobs were scarce, and the weight of responsibility often pressed on him like the snow pressing against his roof. Yet Martin was not a man to quit. He had faced sandstorms in the Middle East, firefights that shook the ground, and nights when the stars were his only shield. A snowstorm in Montana, though fierce, was something he thought he could handle. But that night was different. The power lines had already gone down, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the flickering glow of the fireplace. Supplies were running low, and he had promised Lucas they would ride out the storm together. They had blankets stacked, canned food set aside, and a dog named Duke snoring by the fire. The boy trusted his father, and Martin carried that trust like a badge of honor. Then, just past midnight, came the sound. At first, Martin thought it was the wind hammering against the door again, but then it grew louder, deliberate, insistent. Someone was knocking. His heart tightened. Who in their right mind would be out in weather like this? Grabbing the old shotgun that leaned against the wall, an instinct he carried since his service, Martin crept toward the door. Lucas stirred on the couch, rubbing his eyes, whispering, "Dad, who is it?" Martin motioned for him to stay put. When he opened the door, he froze. There, standing in the blizzard's fury, were 15 men. Leather jackets covered in snow, boots caked in ice, beards frosted white, and on their backs, unmistakable patches glared through the storm's veil. Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. For a split second, Martin's mind flashed through every story he had ever heard about them: outlaws, rough riders, men who lived by their own code. Instinct screamed to shut the door. But then he looked closer. Their faces weren't hard with anger, they were desperate, worn, and pale with cold. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward and shouted over the wind, "Our bikes are stranded down the road. We'll freeze out here. Please, man, help us." Martin felt Lucas watching from the couch, his small face pale with fear. The boy had seen the patches too. The weight of the decision pressed on Martin's chest. He was outnumbered, alone, a father with a child to protect. But he was also a soldier, and a soldier knew what it meant to be stranded in the cold. No man survives long against the elements. Martin lowered the shotgun and opened the door wider. "Get inside before you freeze to death." The bikers shuffled in, one by one, their boots stomping snow onto the wooden floor, the smell of leather and exhaust filling the cabin. Lucas clutched Duke tightly, eyes wide, but Martin gave him a small nod. The same nod he once gave his men in the field, a silent promise that everything would be all right. The angels gathered near the fire, thawing their frozen hands. They introduced themselves not with menace, but with gratitude. Their leader, the scarred man who had spoken first, said his name was Jax. He explained that they had been riding across the state when the storm hit harder than expected. Their bikes had been abandoned on the roadside, engines dead in the snow, and they had trudged through the whiteout for miles looking for shelter. Without Martin's cabin, they would have been buried by morning. Martin offered them blankets, heated up canned soup, and gave them water. It wasn't much, but it was survival. The bikers, hardened men with reputations that stretched across the country, accepted his hospitality with quiet respect. Lucas stayed close to his dad, watching the rough strangers, but as the hours passed, he noticed something unusual. These men, feared by so many, softened in the warmth of the fire. They laughed in low voices, shared stories of rides and roads, and one even pulled out a harmonica, filling the cabin with a slow, mournful tune. For Martin, it was surreal. Here he was, a single father with barely enough to provide for his boy, housing 15 members of one of the most infamous motorcycle clubs in the world. Yet instead of chaos, there was peace. Morning came slowly, the storm easing into silence. The world outside was buried under feet of snow, a white desert stretching in all directions. The bikers knew they couldn't move their bikes until the roads were cleared, but they insisted they would leave as soon as possible. Before they left, Jax pulled Martin aside. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Most folks would have slammed the door in our faces. You saved our lives, man. We don't forget something like that." Martin shrugged. "Wasn't about who you are. It was about the storm. A man freezing outside is still a man." Jax studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Hayes. We'll remember you." With that, the bikers trudged back into the snow, leaving Martin and Lucas alone once again. The cabin felt emptier, but warmer somehow, as if the fire they had shared burned brighter in memory. Martin thought that was the end of it. A strange night, a dangerous gamble, but one that proved humanity still mattered. He went back to chopping wood, rationing food, and trying to stretch every dollar from his veteran's check. Life returned to the usual struggles. But a week later, everything changed. It was a crisp morning when Martin heard the sound. At first, it was a low rumble in the distance, like thunder rolling across the plains. Then it grew louder, sharper, and soon the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Martin stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the pale sun, and froze. Down the road, stretching as far as the eye could see, came motorcycles. Dozens of them, hundreds, chrome gleaming, engines roaring, leather jackets flashing in the light. They rolled in like an army, powerful and unyielding, the thunder of their engines echoing across the valley. Lucas ran outside, his eyes wide. "Dad, look." By the time the bikes reached the cabin, Martin counted at least 102 of them. A sea of riders, lined up in perfect rows, engines idling like growling beasts. And at the front, on a massive Harley with handlebars reaching for the sky, sat Jax. He killed the engine, swung off the bike, and walked up the path with a smile. Martin stood his ground, bewildered. "What is this?" he asked. "This," Jax said, sweeping his arm toward the riders behind him, "is our thank you." The angels had returned, not 15 this time, but more than 100. Word of Martin's kindness had spread through their chapters like wildfire. A veteran, a single dad, opening his home to men the world feared. That wasn't something they could ignore. They came bearing gifts, groceries enough to fill the cabin, boxes of firewood, a brand new generator to keep the power on during storms, even a refurbished pickup truck to replace Martin's rusted-out old one. But it didn't stop there. They started repairing his cabin, fixing the roof, insulating the walls, building a shed out back. Lucas got a new bike of his own, small, safe, painted red with flames, delivered by one of the bikers who said every boy needed to learn the joy of the road. Martin stood there, stunned, unable to speak. For years he had carried his burdens alone, never asking for help, never expecting kindness. Now, 102 men stood at his door, brothers by choice, paying him back for one night of humanity. And as Lucas rode circles in the snow on his new bike, laughing for the first time in weeks, Martin felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The story of the veteran who sheltered the Hells Angels spread beyond Montana, picked up by newspapers and whispered in online forums. Some called it unbelievable, others called it inspiring, but to Martin and Lucas, it was simply life, a reminder that sometimes the roughest exteriors hide the deepest loyalties, and that one act of kindness can ripple across 100 lives. From that day forward, Martin was never alone. Whenever the snow piled too high or the road grew too rough, the roar of engines could be heard in the distance, a promise that family isn't always blood, it's the ones who show up when the storm hits.